flag laws. We are also stepping up our work on environmental justice. Communities of color, low-income communities, and tribal communities often suffer the most harm from environmental crimes and pollution. Among our efforts, we are seeking increased resources for our Environment and Natural Resource Division to help these vulnerable populations. The antitrust laws are the charter of our economic liberty, and the Justice Department is committed to enforcing them. The FY22 request for increased resources for the Antitrust Division reflects that commitment. Finally, there are nearly 1.3 million cases pending before the immigration courts. A 21% budget increase for the Executive Office for Immigration Review will help support 100 new immigration judges, improve technology, and other efficiency mechanisms to reduce that backlog. I have mentioned only a few of the department's important programs this morning. I ask your support for our budget as the entire department works to ensure adherence to the rule of law, protection of public safety, and equal justice for all Americans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attorney General Garland. At this time, we'll start the questioning period. I'll open by recognizing myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I want to start with civil rights and in particular, voting rights. I'm 60 years old, Attorney General Garland, and for almost my entire life, what was normal in the United States was that if a jurisdiction wanted to change its voting laws, it had to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department or the District Court in the District of Columbia. That was because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 came about largely because of the efforts of our dear departed colleague, John Lewis, and his efforts that culminated in Bloody Sunday in Selma, Alabama in the spring of 1965. And it led to the passage of that bill and into law in August. That was sustained by the United States Supreme Court in South Carolina versus Katzenbach the next year. And it has been called one of the most effective pieces of civil rights legislation in American history. In fact, that was called that by the Justice Department in 2014. All of that was upended in 2013 by the Shelby County decision, which all of a sudden invalidated the pre-clearance requirement. So now, instead of normal, what we have is the Justice Department has to file suit every time there's an unconstitutional change in voting laws that offends the 15th Amendment or some other part of the Constitution. And as a result, your Justice Department has to spend a lot more money filing lawsuits to reverse these voting law changes. Am I correct in that? You're muted, sir.
I'm sorry, we'll try to get the technology better. This is my first virtual hearing. Yes, you are correct. Shelby County invalidated the coverage formula, which permitted the pre-clearance program to continue. So it is now the case that the Justice Department is largely limited to bringing affirmative cases in which it finds under Section 2 of the Act unconstitutional practices or procedures with respect to voting that discriminate against the race. This does require us to bring individual cases. That is a much more time-consuming and more expensive process.
In fact, what it does is it reverses the burden of proof. It was normal during the vast bulk of my lifetime that if a jurisdiction wanted to change their voting laws, it was a jurisdiction that was listed as among those having traditionally and historically violated the Constitution for voting rights. The jurisdiction like that wanted to change its voting laws, you know, to make people guess how many jelly beans are in the jar, or to enact sweeping purges of voting rolls, things like that. they had to get pre-clearance. They had to get permission from the Attorney General. And so the Attorney General was in control of that. Now it's all flipped on its head. The Attorney General has to file a lawsuit and carry the burden of proof, which could involve months and months and even years of litigation to invalidate, a Jim Crow kind of a voting law change like that. Am I correct, Attorney General? You're muted again, sir.
Am I mute now?
I can hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just get back to the question. You are correct that the burden of proof is now on the Justice Department to prove in each individual case a violation of the Voting Rights Act.
Well, what we're here to talk about are resources for your Department of Justice. What does that mean? If we have any hope of preserving voting rights in the parts of this country that historically discriminated against African Americans and others on the basis of race for voting rights, if we have any hope of combating these changes, that are being enacted vigorously now in the United States, how much money is it going to cost the American taxpayer because of that Shelby County decision?
The right to vote is absolutely fundamental. It is the cornerstone of our democracy. The Justice Department is pledged as part of its original purpose and its establishment during Reconstruction to protect voting rights. The 1965 Voting Rights Act gave us additional authorities, one part of which was removed as a consequence of the Shelby County case. We do now have to bring each case individually, and you are correct, that is a very large investment of resources, and that's part of the reason why we're asking for the 15.8% increase in the budget for the Civil Rights Division.
Well, I thank you for that, and I yield now to our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Adderholt, for 5 minutes of questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General, my first question would involve the immigration courts. Advocates have claimed that 89% of all asylum applicants attended their final court hearing to receive a decision on their application. However, this claim is misleading because the DOJ's own stats demonstrate that 38% of individuals whose cases began with a credible fear never even bothered to file an asylum application, despite claiming a fear of returning to their home country. Hence, they are not even being counted among the pool of asylum applicants. Based on this information, do you agree that the stats like the doubtful 89% statistic I mentioned don't tell the whole story of the immigration enforcement crisis that's currently going on in this country?
Congressman, I'm not familiar with these specific statistics, nor the rebuttals of the specifics that you presented, but I will certainly ask my team and the people who don't know those statistics to get back to your staff on that.
Okay, that would be helpful if you could do that. And could you tell us what specific measures that you have implemented, or maybe that you plan to implement, to enforce the immigration laws and protect the current rule of law?
Yes, so there are, for the Department of Justice, there are a number of issues. I'll make clear, of course, that the Border Patrol and the Customs and ICE are all in the Department of Homeland Security, and so they have the primary responsibility at the border. We have a large number of U.S. attorneys at the border who prosecute the cases that are brought to them by the Department of Homeland Security agents, and so part of our budget request is for money for them. Then we do manage the immigration courts, the immigration judges. That's our Executive Office of Immigration review. That's the principal amount of the increase in money that we're asking for in this area, an increase of 21%. That's because we had, at the time the new administration took office, over 1 million cases backlog in that system. We're going to need new additional immigration judges. So part of this increase is to add 100 immigration judges plus the teams of support and technology that are necessary to accelerate the hearings in those cases.
Okay. As is noted, the immigration court's backlog stands over 1.3 million cases. I think that you have noted that. In 25 hearing locations, understand that an individual will wait over 3 years for adjudication, and in 3 locations they'll wait over 4 years. The previous administration implemented a case-based performance metrics as a basis for evaluating immigration court judicial resources. Are those performance metrics still being utilized under your administration?
So can you hear me?
Yes.
My understanding is that the Executive Office of Immigration Review is reviewing the nature of those metrics, trying to figure out ways of accelerating performance. Of course, any system requires some set of metrics. Precisely which metrics are reviewed on a regular routine basis. And we're going to be doing that to ensure that we both provide due process for the people coming through the system, but also efficiency for the system itself.
What effects is the pending caseload having on due process? And do you have any concern about that issue at all?
I'm very concerned about the backlog. I think it obviously is not working for the people who are in the system and not working for the government with respect to evaluating those people. We have cut IJ hiring times, IJ immigration judges, from 2+ years now to approximately 6 months. So we expect to be able to get a lot more immigration judges in than so far we have been able to hire, and then we're asking for an additional 100 as well. That should, of course, cut the backlog.
Okay, but due process is something you were concerned about in this regard.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Of course, the longer people are waiting, and the bigger the workload, and the faster judges have to decide, the less due process is provided. So we're concerned to get the right balance.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Adderholt. At this time, the chair recognizes Representative Grace Meng for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations again, Mr. Attorney General Garland. I wanted to applaud your March 30th memorandum, which directs a 30-day review and commitment to a whole of agency approach to addressing hate-based violence and incidents against the Asian Pacific American community. I appreciate so much your leadership and shows the community that their concerns are our government's concerns. As you know, May is Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, and I believe this month's celebration should be a clarion call for the community and our nation to shout that anti-Asian hate is unequivocally wrong. Can you share with this subcommittee what the findings and recommendations are? And what additional resources do you need to ensure the change you envision will succeed? And part 2 of this question is, while your memo discusses the need for better resources to combat hate crimes, you also state correctly that communities will need additional tools to heal after hateful incidents occur. There's a great role for DOJ's Community Relations Service to play in affected by hate crimes and violence, including those who are the ones who commit the acts. Some communities are distrustful of law enforcement and attorneys' offices, but may be more receptive to someone from CRS for solutions that bring restorative justice and peace to their community. So I wanted to ask, from your perspective, is CRS scalable, and how can we work, if increasing funds, that to work to ensure that CRS will engage with communities on the ground? And separately, how can DOJ help local community groups seek help outside of the criminal justice system, developing alternatives to carceral punishment for those convicted of hate crimes?
Well, you hit on a question that's I only recently realized was extremely important, not the hate crimes issue, but the community relations service one. So I'm very familiar with the service, it having been quite important the last time I was at the Justice Department and doing the kind of work you're talking about, in developing better relationships between communities, victims, and police. So one of the first things I did when we were all concerned about what might be happening in Minneapolis was to call and ask that members of the Community Relations Service to assess how many there were there and how many more could be brought. Sadly, I learned we only had about 26 or 27 total members of the Community Relations Service at this point. That service has, I would say, badly withered over the years, over quite a number of years. And so an important part of our request for a budget increase for the Civil Rights Division is to increase hiring for the Community Relations Service. So I think it's a very good point you raised, and I'm not sure that many people understand what good work the Community Relations Service can do. With respect to the hate crimes issue, a significant part also of the money increase for Civil Rights Division will go to hate crime prosecutions. The division does prosecute those, and with the additional money, we'll be able to look into that further. You're also right that prosecution isn't the only solution here. And so we have grant programs under the Office of Justice Programs that we're hoping to move in that direction. You asked for non-incarceral resolutions, and so part of that is what's called restorative justice, a chance for victims and victimizers to work, get together in a certain way to both reduce recidivism and to reduce the pain felt by the victim. So there are a number of, it's a pretty broad set of programs that we have available in this area.
Thank you so much. I really look forward to working with you on this issue.
Thank you.
I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Meng. At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Palazzo for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Attorney General Garland, thank you for being here today. I would like to briefly address the crisis that we have at our southern border. It seems to be somewhat of a manufactured crisis, but it is a crisis. It is a huge challenge. We basically have an invasion taking place in our southern border. And listen, I know we got to handle this in a humanitarian way, and I'm all for that, but we're also a nation of law and order. And without law and order, we're creating chaos. My biggest concern is the flow of people, not those who are coming through the points of entry, but it's the ones that are taking advantage of this crisis. And it's the human trafficking, it's the drug smuggling, it's the bringing in of foreign nationals, some who have been apprehended that we know are on the terror watch list. So can you address what is the Department of Justice seeing at the border? Are there foreign actors coming across that could be dangerous? I mean, what are we doing? I mean, because we all respect, the FBI and our law enforcement communities and officers, and I just feel like that we're just adding a huge burden upon them, but more so upon our local law enforcement officers who are going to have to be basically dealing with the criminal activity that's coming across and the hard narcotics in their backyards. Can you quickly address what the Department of Justice is doing, and how are you advising the administration to get this under control?
Look, the issue of major narcotics traffickers sending narcotics across the border is a vital concern to us, particularly now the transition to the synthetic opioids, to the fentanyl analogs. The precursors of these are coming in some part from China, moving into Mexico, then moving across the border. We have put a lot of effort into interdiction and into enforcement on this. We're spending $2.2 billion in the current FY21 budget across DOJ for immigration Southwest border enforcement. This funds our DEA agents, and as I mentioned in the previous question, our prosecutors in the Southwest border. One of the first things I did internationally as Attorney General was to speak to the Attorney General of Mexico to seek and confirm his cooperation with respect to fighting transnational narcotics organizations, and he pledged his support to this as well. So this is a serious problem, and we are seized with it.
Well, one thing's for sure, the transnational criminal organizations are making a fortune off the crisis at the border, and the flow of drugs. I mean, if you just look at what the Coast Guard's pulling off the oceans before it makes its way into America, and we're talking about hundreds of millions of tons of cocaine over the past several years, and it's going to be a huge crisis. I mean, we already have so many issues facing our country. Real quick, can you address what are we doing to counter China, especially in their theft of international or intellectual property? We know they love to steal our technology, and it's actually allowed them to close the technological gap to actually exceed us in some areas, which is a national security crisis as well. But it's also just a theft of trillions of dollars of our resources paid for either private or public institutions here in America. Obviously, it's unfair. They don't see it that way. They see it as all being, fair game to steal other countries, intellectual property. What's the DOJ doing to counter that? And are y'all prosecuting individuals engaged in theft of our international property?
Within the last month or so, the intelligence community has identified China as a threat in precisely the regard that you mentioned with respect to espionage, with respect to theft of intellectual property. So, the FBI is working very hard on these issues. There's also obviously an important cyber crime and a cyber hacking element of this. And so a lot of money and new resources are being put into protecting against that hacking and then prosecuting where we're unsuccessful in protection and then plugging the holes.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate your time, and yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Palazzo. At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Case of Hawaii for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Attorney General Garland. First of all, I want to, as a representative from Hawaii with the highest percentage of Asia Pacific Americans in the entire country, I want to fully associate myself with my colleague Ms. Meng's remarks as to hate crimes, as well as to endorse your efforts to take a whole of government approach. That's critical for us to get to the bottom of this and do whatever we can in that regard. So I appreciate your effort on that front. Second, as to Mr. Palazzo's comments about China, the Department of Justice does have the China initiative underway, which I believe is appropriate under the circumstances. I don't think any of us should be under any illusions as to what China is up to here. However, there have been many concerns across our country, especially in our Chinese American community, as to really profiling of Chinese Americans in connection with reviews of China's interference and theft of our intellectual property, et cetera, particularly in our institutions of higher learning. So I would simply relay a caution to you that please be very attentive to those concerns and take them seriously. The intelligence community has done that, and within your own organization, I hope you will as well. Let me cover an issue which is not specific to Hawaii, but impacts us in particular, and that is that in our federal district court system, our District of Hawaii has been without a residential reentry center for almost 2 years now. We had a residential reentry center, or halfway house, if you want to refer to it as that, for 29 years until 2019, when the situation changed, and we have been struggling with DOJ and the Bureau of Prisons in particular to get one up and running again. And of course, you know from your own experience that the consequence of the absence of a residential reentry center not only prevents a reintegration of federal inmates into their community, but in the case of the District of Hawaii, and I think this is true beyond the District of Hawaii, the courts utilize that as an alternative to incarceration for two distinct populations: pretrial release and those on supervised release, or so-called public law placement. When you dig down to the bottom of this issue, it seems to be a question. It seems to be a question of unrealistic expectations being placed on the solicitation process and the bid process. We are in a unique situation here in Hawaii, and essentially the solicitations are ruling out any effective bids on this, and that's just not acceptable. We cannot send our prisoners and former inmates to the continental United States for these purposes. We shouldn't have to do that. The discussion has been the alternative of day release, which is not going to do the trick. And so I would simply ask for your own personal review and attention to this issue to see whether we can't punch through this and get that solution in place as soon as possible. May I respectfully request that?
Yes, of course. Residential reentry is critical to the First Step Act and the Second Chance Act approaches, which were passed by Congress. They are the way, both to reduce our prison population and also to prevent recidivism and to make it easier for people to reintegrate into the community and become good citizens within the community. So they are quite essential in that regard. I don't know the specifics with respect to the entry program in Hawaii, although I do understand that there's a new solicitation being worked on, and I will ask my members of the team to work this up and then talk to your staff about it directly.
Thank you very much, Attorney General. My remaining time, let me just follow up on Mr. Palazzo's comments on immigration, and I won't have time for you to respond, but I leave this with you. In reviewing immigration and especially a recent trip to the border, it became crystal clear to me that the burden on our immigration judges is in fact very, very acute, and is essentially incentivizing, as Mr. Palazzo said, the cartels to manipulate weaknesses in our system to basically enhance human trafficking and their profits. And the critical weakness here is a lack of adjudication on a timely matter of immigration related issues. And so my question to you, and we can take this up after the fact, is your request itself sufficient to handle what you view as a huge problem? Is that going to do the job in terms of re-incentivizing that? And I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave you with that hanging question and hopefully take it up with you in some other way. But it's a rhetorical question. Is that enough? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Case. And we'll allow the witness to answer. Take 30 seconds and tell us what you can in that space of time, Attorney General.
So, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So We have asked for a substantial increase for immigration judges, and equally important for the whole team that supports immigration judges. This will be extremely helpful for us at this point, and this is the amount that we need right now.
Thank you.
At this time, the chair recognizes Congressman Ben Klein for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Cartwright. I appreciate you and Ranking Member Adderholt for holding today's hearing. Ensuring that our justice system is operating effectively and efficiently in accordance with the law is essential, and I appreciate the Attorney General, his appearance before us today to discuss the department's funding request. I'll go out of order in my questions briefly just to address the burden on immigration judges. I would posit that it is a direct result of this administration's changes in policies and put in place a catch and release program, repealing of remain across the border while their asylum claims are being heard, the numerous policy changes that have incentivized individuals to make this journey with small children and claim asylum when for no other reason other than they are trying to escape poverty. Now, that is a reason to explore legal immigration process and reforms, but I would argue that it is not cause for asylum. And I would argue that before we grant a significant increase in funding for immigration judges, we need to see some recognition by this administration that it is first indeed a crisis, and secondly, that they are taking steps to address this crisis by restoring some order to the border and some structure to enforcing our border. I want to ask the Attorney General, in the past, GAO has estimated that the department has not collected most of the outstanding criminal debt, both fines and restitution, due to, among other factors, the nature of the debt and a lack of coordination between relevant DOJ components. My last report was that it was under a 5% collection rate. That is abhorrent. At the end of fiscal year 2016, DOJ had identified $10 billion of outstanding collectible restitution debt. So as you come asking for an increase in budgeting, is collecting this debt a priority for the department at all? And is DOJ adequately measuring its criminal debt collection performance against any established goals?
Well, certainly bringing in the money that is owed is very important to the department. This problem of debt collection has been a problem for since the last time I was in the Justice Department, and I certainly will draw my attention to this again. Of course, the restitution issue doesn't go to the government; the restitution goes to the victims. But I will certainly look at this question. The more money we can bring in from people who owe us money, the less money we would need from you. Although, again, I don't believe the debt goes directly to the Justice Department, but to the Treasury as is appropriate.
I appreciate that. Shifting over to another topic. Last year, we saw an unprecedented and an overwhelming number of firearms sales, and with those sales, an unprecedented increase in checks run through the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. In fact, the one-year increase from 2019 to 2020 alone was nearly 40%. In your opinion, does NICS have the necessary resources to handle what I'd imagine is continued strain on the system? And can you provide the committee with the latest stats on the percentage of background checks that fall into, rather than proceed or denied status, delayed status, and the percentage of those checks that are then resolved within 3 business days, 10, 30, and 88 business days when they're purged from the system?
Well, Congressman, you're absolutely right that the more sales there are, the more pressure there is on NICS to do the background checks. Obviously, absolutely right. We have in FY21, we received $168 million for expanding NICS capacity and to address the workload increases for FBI and ATF. So we have resources that we're now being able to put into this problem. I don't know the statistics. I know the issue that you're talking about. I don't know the statistics on how long a delay there is and whether it's satisfied within the 3-day proceed window.
Well, if you could get those to us, I'd appreciate that.
Of course, and we will do that.
I'll just ask one more question. current law requires a prospective buyer of a firearm to provide a photo ID to exercise this core constitutional right. Would you argue that that is a reasonable requirement?
I, I would, but I don't know what the requirements are. Again, this is slightly beyond my area of expertise, and I'd have to look into what the requirements are.
Well, 26A on the form requires a valid government photo ID. So,
Well, there you have it. Then that's the answer.
and you would argue that that is a responsible requirement.
I would.
Would you also argue that to exercise your constitutional right to vote, that requiring a photo ID, government issued photo ID, would also be a reasonable requirement? I'm sorry, you're muted, sir.
I'm sorry.
There we go.
I think I may be being muted by the committee, subcommittee every time a member speaks, but we're doing the best we can here. So,
I appreciate that.
I'm sorry.
Would you consider that?
Yeah. So the question on voter ID is what kind of disparate impact it has on voters of different races, colors, and language groups, and whether it violates the Constitution by having a disparate impact on people's ability to vote. Supreme Court has held that voter ID as a concept is constitutional. And the issue is what, in any individual case, does the records show about whether it deprives certain groups protected by the 14th Amendment right to vote. That's the question. It's not a question of whether voter ID is sensible or not sensible. It's a question of how it impacts and what the cost of that impact is, and what.
But you don't ask that question for a Second Amendment rights when they're purchasing a firearm.
I think you
Mr.
would.
Klein, we're going to have a second round of questions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. At this time, the chair recognizes Congresswoman Brenda Lawrence for 5 minutes of questions.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, and congratulations, Attorney General. I wanted to ask a question about mental health and law enforcement. The Biden administration's skinny budget includes an incentive to partner mental health providers with law enforcement across the country, which I believe is incredibly important as we look toward ensuring that community policing and meeting the needs of all of our residents. Will the department be taking any efforts to prioritize grant applicants who intend to use funds to expand or create partnerships between mental health providers and law enforcement?
I think the answer in general to that is yes. We do believe that taking the burden off of law enforcement, particularly with respect to some of these very high-risk contacts with people who have mental disabilities or who are in crisis for any other reason, and to bring along or to substitute social workers and mental health care professionals is a good way to reduce risk for the officer and for the person who's involved. So there's $271 million in our OJP increase request, the Office of Justice Programs, to reforming court processes, and this also includes separately the question of having mental health courts and drug courts, which is another related issue to the one you were asking about.
Thank you so much. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Civil Rights Division. For example, after years of arguing that a Texas voter ID law intentionally discriminated against minorities, the previous administration, Justice Department, abandoned that position. Today, states across the country, including my home state of Michigan, are attempting to pass restrictive measures that will clearly make it harder for Americans to vote. Additionally, even a number of hate crimes across the country spiked, and federal prosecutors of hate crimes have come close to keeping pace. After can you explain how the Civil Rights Division will once again return to its mission to uphold civil and constitutional rights for all Americans?
The Justice Department, as I mentioned, was founded with the principal original purpose of protecting the rights of African Americans during Reconstruction, their rights, particularly with respect to voting, but also with respect to protection against domestic violent extremists, and the first incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan. That was the original purpose of the department, reinvigorated when the Civil Rights Division was created by one of the Civil Rights Acts. We are carrying that forward now by requesting a 18.6% increase in our budget for civil rights enforcement over last year. A portion of that money will go into the voting rights issues about which you were just speaking. And a portion of that money will also go into protection against and enforcement of hate crimes statutes, which Congress has provided us.
Ms. Lawrence, you are muted, I think.
Two things are really important to me. The mental health piece. When we look at justice and policing, and we see so many people who are mentally ill, and we see police officers who are not equipped to respond to a person having a psychotic episode versus a criminal. In addition to that, if you truly believe in something, it will be funded, and it will be a department under your leadership that will actively uphold their responsibility when it comes to civil rights. So I look forward to your leadership. Thank you so much. And we have a lot of work to do in your department. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Lawrence. At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Attorney General, thank you. Congratulations on the appointment, and thank you for your service to our beautiful nation and the monumental mission you have in front of you here. I'm from California, northern LA County. We are a state where we have a legal cannabis industry, but we're also a state, and especially in my district in the deserts above Los Angeles, where we're seeing a massive influx of an illegal marijuana industry. And I think it's being understated at local levels, at state levels, and certainly not appreciated at the federal level. I've been able to take a tour with the local law enforcement agencies to see it from the air. And I can tell you firsthand that if you remember the first time you went flying over a small neighborhood, your reaction was probably, wow, I can't believe there's this many pools in our neighborhoods. I had the same reaction when I toured our Antelope Valley area with regards to these illegal pot operations. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of these greenhouses being propped up in our deserts. In areas where frankly, vegetation should not be growing. It's difficult to farm out here. What's happening is we have folks who are operating illegally on a black market who are stealing natural resources. They're stealing water. In many cases, the folks working these illegal pot operations are indentured servants illegally here, trying to make ends meet and being taken advantage. We have folks being local citizens being intimidated by some of these transnational criminal organizations that are running these illegal marijuana operations. The magnitude of this problem is staggering. And I know that the federal government, I know that DOJ under DEA has pots of money that do go towards eradicating these illegal marijuana operations. But it is at a magnitude, like I said, that's beyond comprehension, I think, and I really do believe it's worth the DOJ's attention not only at the federal level, but also in support of the local law enforcement agencies. My question is what, in your opinion, can be done from a federal level to help prosecute folks who are growing marijuana illegally? There's a series of charges that have been deemed really misdemeanors: the distribution, the sale, the growing of marijuana in California is treated as misdemeanors, but the stealing of natural resources, in some cases, the squatting on land, the intimidation against local residents for reporting
is being recorded.
Is rising to the level of felony behavior, and frankly, it is a true security issue at the local level, but also national security. What can we do at the federal level under your administration and your leadership to help us eradicate the illegal marijuana problem?
Well, I'm not precisely familiar with the specifics, obviously, that you were able to see through your aerial flights. But the department's view on marijuana use is that enforcement against use is not a good use of our resources. I understand that's not what you're talking about. You're really talking about growing it and manufacturing at a large scale. It's probably not a good use of our resources where it is regulated by the state. And again, I take it that that's not what you're asking about. So to the extent you're asking, for example, about transnational operations of large amounts coming from Mexico, or of transnational operators who are coming into the United States to do the growing, these are certainly within our jurisdiction and within our scope of concern.
Well, thank you, Attorney General. I would love to host you out here to get you and your respective points of contact a first row view of what's going on out here. It is staggering. The local law enforcement agencies get about $19,000 per year from the federal government for overtime to help fight this. They hit that cap, that $19,000 limit, usually in June or July of each year, and it's frankly not enough. And like I said, we've had 7 dead bodies show up at these illegal grows here in Southern California just in the last few months. Would really appreciate hosting you out here and getting not only the DEA, but also ATF and FBI representatives to see firsthand what we're seeing on the ground here. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Garcia. At this time, the chair recognizes Mr. Trone of Maryland for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. And Attorney General Garland, it's great to be here with you today. For the last decade or so, my office has been in Bethesda, so we're neighbors, and it's awesome to have someone of your qualifications in this job. I want to start off today about pretrial and jail incarceration rates. Even short stays, pretrial detention is associated with harmful outcomes, costing people their jobs, their homes, lose custody of their kids. This practice is also leads to an increased likelihood of being convicted, receiving a harsher sentence, and future involvement in the criminal justice system. The pretrial detention rates in the federal system are at a record level. 75% of individuals detained pretrial. Disproportionately, this falls on people of color. Federal prosecutors have requested from 56% in 1997, now up to 77%, even though the data shows 99% of those released return to jail, to court. So, Mr. Garland, could you speak to DOJ's current pretrial retention policies and your views on pretrial detention?
Congressman, I quite agree with the concerns you express. I do think that unnecessary pretrial detention does make it harder for somebody to build a case to defend themselves, which is point one. And point two often means they lose their job, which even if they are then adjudicated as not guilty, damages their ability to make a livelihood. So there's no question about that. I served when I was the chief judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit on the executive committee of the Pretrial Services Agency for the District of Columbia. That's a statutory appointment. That agency has a nation-leading reputation for analyzing pretrial detainees and making recommendations to judges about which ones need to be detained, which ones don't, and what kind of more minimal conditions can be required. So, because they have a very good method of figuring out who might recidivate while on release or after release. And I know that the judges of both the federal court and the Superior Court are happy with the results of that. So one thing might be to help model that program in other districts. The federal law permits pretrial detention only if there's no combination of other kinds of conditions that will ensure the return of the person who's been arrested and secure the safety of the community. That's the underlying test. There are provisions that provide a presumption of detention when the sentence faced is extremely high or when the crime itself is extremely dangerous. But even in those circumstances, it's only a presumption.
According to the VERA Center for Justice, after the enactment of the core crime bill, we spent $127 million a year on pretrial detention. Today's dollars. Today, that's over $2 billion. Yet our prison population has been reduced significantly from where it was 3 decades ago. Does this seem like somewhat of an outsized increase to you, given these crime rates are lower?
I honestly don't know. I don't know the VERA statistics. I don't whether the reference is to federal pretrial detention or not. As you can imagine, we are not charging people with low-level crimes in order to prioritize our resources and, frankly, to be fair and just. We are looking for only in the area of street crime, violent offenders, big-time offenders. So it may be that our detention statistics are higher than you might guess. For example, if what we're looking at is what a local prosecutor brings in. But to be honest, I simply don't know the statistics that you're citing.
Thank you. That's the federal number. Quickly, the president's skinny budget outlined $1.5 billion, an increase over $500 million for grants to support the reform of state and local criminal justice systems, including federal funding to support diversions and alternative court programs.
Right.
Can you expand on how the funding could be used, allocated to safely reduce rates of pretrial detention?
Well, that's part of the important role that these alternative programs provide. The drug courts, the mental health courts often allow people released on personal recognizance, released altogether, pending various kinds of agreements to monitoring and substance abuse, taking substance abuse programs, that sort of thing. And as you said, there's a $271 million in the OJP, Office of Justice Programs proposal, which can be given for those kinds of programs.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. General Garland and members of our subcommittee, we will now take a 10-minute recess, and we will resume for our second round of questioning at 11:25 a.m. We're in recess.